Hunters made fun of her, thinking she was just a normal person. They didn't know she was the 400-year-old vampire queen. The hunters pulled her through the town in chains, laughing at the silly woman who dared to fight vampires with a pitchfork. They called her careless, weak, just a regular town person trying to be a hero. What they didn't know was that the woman they made fun of for being weak was the 400-year-old vampire queen, and she'd been protecting them all along. The screams of children filled the empty barn as three mean vampires moved around their easy targets like wolves around a hurt deer. Moonlight shined through broken wooden boards, making strange shadows that moved with the monsters. Their eyes glowed an unusual red, fangs shining because they were excited as they hissed and growled at the scared young ones hiding in the corner. "Please, we didn't do anything wrong," cried a blonde girl. She was no more than 10 years old, holding a wooden cross that shook in her small hands. The biggest vampire, his light skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones, laughed a sound like glass breaking. "Wrong place, wrong time, little ones. Your blood will taste so much sweeter mixed with fear." That's when she showed up. A person stepped out of the shadows near the barn's entrance, a woman who looked to be in her late 20s, with hair the color of reddish-brown and bright green eyes. She wore plain jeans and a dark jacket, looking totally normal, except for the way she moved with smooth, hunting grace. To anyone watching, she seemed like just another townsperson who'd walked into a dangerous situation. "Let them go," she said quietly, her voice having a strange power that made the vampires stop. The largest mean one turned toward her, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Well, well," he said, "another little lamb wandering into the slaughter. How thoughtful. We'll have appetizers before the main course." The woman, Seline, took a step forward. Inside, ancient power rushed through her body like liquid fire. Memories of countless fights and defeated enemies filled her mind. She could end this in seconds, could rip these weak, mean vampires apart with her bare hands before they even knew what hit them. But she couldn't, not without showing them what she truly was. 400 years of hiding, she thought sadly. 400 years of letting them believe the old stories were just myths. "I said let them go this time." Just a tiny bit of her true nature slipped out, enough to make the air around her sparkle with energy she was barely holding back. The mean ones traded looks, suddenly unsure. They could feel something was different about this woman, but their overconfidence ignored their instincts. "Kill her first," the leader snarled. "Then we feast on the children." They attacked all at once. Seline moved like a flowing shadow, but she forced herself to fight like a human would, slower, more clumsy, more desperate. She grabbed a rusty pitchfork from the barn wall and used it with skilled ease, though she made it look like lucky desperation. When the first vampire jumped at her, she shoved the makeshift weapon through his chest, but not quite deep enough to reach his heart. He screamed and stumbled back, black blood pouring from the wound. "Too easy," she thought, pulling back her strength even more. "Must look like I'm struggling." The second vampire went around behind her while she wrestled with the third. She could hear his approach, every heartbeat, every breath, every quiet step. But she pretended not to notice until the very last second. Then she spun and hit him across the face with the pitchfork's handle, sending him crashing into the barn wall with what seemed like a lucky hit. "You're tougher than you look, human," growled the leader, wiping black blood from his cut lip. "But you're still going to die." The fight went on for several more minutes, Seline carefully planning each move to look human while actually protecting both herself and the children. She let the vampires land small hits that would have badly hurt a normal person, crying out in fake pain while making sure none of them got close enough to the scared kids. Finally, she managed to shove the pitchfork deep into the leader's chest, this time finding his heart. He burst into ash with a final shriek. The remaining two, now badly hurt and facing a human who'd somehow killed their leader, ran away into the night instead of facing the same end. Seline leaned against the barn wall, breathing hard and holding a small cut on her arm, the only real injury she'd gotten. The children rushed to her side, tears flowing down their faces. "Thank you, lady. You saved us," the blonde girl cried, wrapping her arms around Celine's waist. "Shh. It's okay now," Seline whispered, gently stroking the child's hair with soft fingers that once commanded armies of the dead. "You're safe." That's when she heard the loud sound of horses' hoofbeats getting closer. Through the barn's broken windows, she could see torches shining in the darkness. The local vampire hunters, arriving too late, as usual. 5 men on horseback burst through the barn doors, crossbows ready and silver stakes shining at their belts. They wore the usual leather armor of their group, with crosses clearly displayed on their chests. Their leader, a tough-looking man in his 40s with gray hair and cold blue eyes, looked at the scene with clear disappointment. "Darn it, Marcus, we missed them again," one of the younger hunters said, lowering his crossbow. Marcus Blackwood, a descendant of the very fighters who had once fought alongside Seline in the old wars, got off his horse and kicked at the pile of vampire ash with his boot. His family name was carved into Celine's memory like a scar. She remembered his great-great-grandfather falling in battle while defending human villages from mean vampire groups. Now his descendants stood before her, not knowing at all who she really was. "Looks like someone beat us to it," Marcus said, his voice full of disrespect as he looked at Seline, a careless town person trying to be a hero, from the looks of it. The other hunters laughed softly, and Seline felt her jaw tighten. These were the descendants of her friends, turned into arrogant fools who'd forgotten their own history. "You're lucky to be alive, woman," another hunter sneered, a man with brownish hair and a constant frown. "What were you thinking? Taking on 3 vampires with farm tools? You could have gotten these children killed with your foolishness." Seline stood up slowly, every feeling inside her telling her to show these disrespectful mortals exactly who they were talking to. Instead, she kept her voice even and humble. "I couldn't just let them hurt the children. I had to try something." "Had to try something," Marcus repeated, making fun of her. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've gotten in the way of official hunter business. These mean vampires were part of a bigger group we've been tracking for weeks. Now they'll move and we'll have to start over." "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "Sorry doesn't bring back our investigation," the brown-haired hunter spat. "You regular people need to learn your place. Leave the monster hunting to those who actually know what they're doing." Seline held back a bitter laugh. She'd been hunting monsters since before their grandfathers were born, but they saw only a lucky woman who'd stumbled into danger. Marcus grabbed her by the arm, and she had to fight the urge to break his wrist without thinking. "You're coming with us. The council needs to hear about this interference. Maybe a night in the wooden stocks will teach you not to meddle in affairs beyond your understanding." "Please," one of the children spoke up. "She saved our lives." "Children don't understand the bigger picture," Marcus said coldly, tying Celine's hands with rough rope. This woman's careless actions could have doomed the entire region. She needs to learn the consequences of playing hero. As they pulled her from the barn toward their horses, Seline caught a smell on the wind that made her blood run cold. An old, familiar scent of rot and evil power. Something far worse than mean vampires was moving through the darkness. Something that would make these hunters' small worries seem funny and unimportant. But they wouldn't listen to warnings from a simple town person. They never did. "If only you knew," she thought sadly, as they tied her to the saddle of Marcus's horse, "that the woman you're dragging away in chains once fought alongside your ancestors to save this very land." The children watched helplessly as the hunters rode away with their savior, vanishing into the night while something ancient and terrible drew ever closer to their village. The hunters' camp was in an open space surrounded by old oak trees, their twisted branches reaching toward the star-filled sky like bony fingers.
Orange flames danced in the stone fire pit at the center, casting flickering shadows across 5 rough faces as the men passed around a bottle of whiskey and shared stories about past fights. Seline sat tied to a thick wooden post nearby, rope cutting into her wrists, though she could have snapped the bonds like thread if she chose to. Marcus Blackwood took a long drink from the bottle and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. You know what the funniest part is? He said, pointing toward Seline with the bottle. She probably thinks she's some kind of hero now, but she'll be telling that story for years, how she single-handedly took down 3 vampires with a rusty pitchfork. The other hunters burst into laughter. James Caldwell, the brown-haired man who'd been so quick to criticize earlier, slapped his knee and grinned. Did you see the way she was swinging that thing around? Like a child playing with sticks. Those mean vampires must have been the weakest vampires alive to lose to that. Maybe they died of embarrassment, added Thomas Reed, a big man with a thick black beard. More laughter filled the open space. Seline kept her face calm, but inside her heart felt like it was being slowly crushed. She remembered James's great-great-grandfather, Jonathan Caldwell, a brave young hunter who charged into battle beside her against an army of mean vampires threatening the northern settlements. Jonathan had looked up to her with such respect and admiration, calling her Your Majesty, even when she insisted he simply call her Seline. He died saving a village of innocent families, and she'd held his hand as life faded from his eyes. Now his descendant sat making fun of the very person who'd once led his ancestor into a great battle. The Blackwood bloodline has protected these lands for over 300 years, Marcus continued, his voice swelling with pride. My family has killed more vampires than any other hunter group on record. We've been humanity's shield and sword since the dark times began. Dark times? Seline thought bitterly. Is that what they call the period when I ruled fairly and kept the peace between humans and vampires? Young David Ashe, barely 20 and eager to prove himself, leaned forward with wide eyes. Tell us about the old days again, Marcus, about how the first Blackwood started the hunter tradition. Marcus's chest puffed with family pride. My great-great-great-grandfather, William Blackwood, was the first to stand against the vampire danger when they tried to take over the human settlements. Back then, people were helpless sheep, hiding in their homes while bloodsuckers ruled the night. But William gathered the bravest men and taught them how to fight back. Celine's hands clenched into fists behind her back. William Blackwood hadn't gathered anyone. He'd been a terrified young blacksmith when she'd personally trained him in vampire fighting techniques. She remembered his shaking hands the first time she'd shown him how to properly use a silver blade. How thankful he'd been when she shared the ancient knowledge that would help protect his people. The stories say there was once a vampire queen who ruled over all the bloodsuckers. They call her the Crimson Regent or some silly name like that. Supposedly, she was so powerful she could control minds and command armies of the dead. Pure fantasy, Marcus scoffed. Vampires are mindless hunters driven by the need for blood. They can't organize, can't plan beyond their next meal. That's why we've been able to hunt them so well. The idea of a vampire ruler is just a scary story parents tell children to keep them inside after dark. Mindless hunters, Seline thought, remembering the council she held, the laws she'd created to protect both humans and vampires, the delicate peace she'd maintained for decades. Under her rule, mean vampires were hunted down and destroyed by their own kind. Human settlements grew under her protection, and trade routes were safer than they'd been in centuries. Even if she existed, James added, she's probably been dead for ages. Nothing lives for 400 years, not even vampires. They're hard to kill, but they're not immortal. David nodded eagerly. Yeah, and even if she was still alive somehow, she'd be ancient and weak by now, probably hiding in some cave somewhere, too scared to show her face. The hunters laughed again, and this time Seline felt something deeper than sadness, a huge feeling of loss that made her chest ache. These men carried the blood of heroes in their veins, descendants of fighters who'd fought alongside her to protect the innocent. But centuries of purposely changed history had ruined their legacy. She remembered the secret meetings in moonlit forests where human hunters and vampire nobles had planned joint missions against mean threats. She remembered the great feast after the Battle of Crimson Valley, where William Blackwood himself had raised a glass to her bravery and wisdom. She remembered Jonathan Caldwell's son learning fighting techniques from vampire masters, and how proud his father had been. All of it forgotten, all of it rewritten. "The truth is," Marcus said, taking another drink, "humans have always been meant to rule this world. We're the better species, smarter, better at adapting, more in the right. Vampires are just another kind of pest, to be killed off like rats or wolves." "What about the old alliance stories?" Peter Morgan asked. "Some of the ancient writings mention working together between humans and vampires." "Propaganda," Thomas declared firmly. "Written by vampire lovers trying to weaken human resolve. The only good vampire is a dead vampire, and that's been true since the beginning of time." Seline closed her eyes and felt the weight of 4 centuries pressing down on her shoulders. She'd watched the truth slowly being erased, one generation at a time. First, the stories of working together became temporary agreements to stop fighting. Then the agreements became clever tricks by sneaky vampires. Finally, any mention of friendship became a sin punishable by being thrown out of the hunter groups. The church had played its part too, changing their teachings to paint all vampires as demons rather than the complicated beings they actually were. Fear was easier to manage than understanding different sides, hatred simpler than caring. Look at her, she's sitting there all quiet and unhappy, probably planning some tearful speech about how she was just trying to help. "Save your breath, woman," Marcus called out to her. "Nothing you say will change your punishment. Dawn's coming, and with it, your execution. Maybe next time you'll think twice about interfering with your betters." Seline opened her eyes and looked directly at Marcus. For just a moment, she let a tiny bit of her true power show. Her green eyes flickered with an unearthly light, and the temperature around the campfire dropped a few degrees. The flames struggled and danced strangely, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The hunters fell silent, suddenly uncomfortable without knowing why. Then Seline pulled her power back, and the moment passed. "There won't be a next time," she said quietly, her voice carrying meanings they couldn't possibly understand. Because by dawn, everything would change. She could smell it on the wind now, the approach of something ancient and evil, something that would force her to reveal the truth these fools had spent centuries trying to hide. The night was about to become much darker than any of them could imagine. The whiskey bottle made another round as the hunters' laughter slowly died down, replaced by the crackling of burning wood and the distant sound of an owl. Marcus wiped his mouth and stood up, stretching his arms above his head with a satisfied sound. "Well, boys, it's been a good night, but we should get some rest. Dawn comes early, and we've got an execution to carry out." "About that," David said hesitantly, glancing towards Seline, "maybe we should question her first. She might know something about the vampire movements in the area." James snorted. "What could she possibly know? She's just a village woman who got lucky." "But she did kill one of them," Peter pointed out. "Maybe she's seen other vampires around. Could be useful information." Thomas shook his head firmly. The council's orders were clear. Any regular person getting in the way of hunter operations is punishable by death. No exceptions. "Since when do we follow every council order exactly? They're not here. We could question her tonight and execute her at dawn. What's the harm?" "The harm, boy, is that discipline keeps our orders strong. Start making exceptions, and soon everyone thinks they can play hero. Next thing you know, we'll have every farmer with a pitchfork thinking they can hunt vampires." "I still think—" "You think too much," James interrupted. "The woman interfered with our investigation and put children at risk with her careless behavior."
She deserves whatever she gets. As the argument continued, Seline's superhearing picked up something the humans couldn't detect. A low, rhythmic sound from deep in the forest. At first, it was barely noticeable, like distant thunder or the beating of massive wings, but it was growing stronger.
Thrum, thrum, thrum. Her blood turned to ice as she recognized it. She knew that sound, had heard it only once before in her 4 centuries of life. It was the synchronized march of an army moving through the night. Not human soldiers, but something far worse. The sound was accompanied by a smell that made her vampire senses pull back in disgust. Ancient rot mixed with fresh blood and something else, something that spoke of power older than her own rule. It was a scent she'd hoped never to encounter again. Malachar. "Listen," she said urgently, interrupting the hunter's debate. "You need to stop arguing and listen to me." "Oh, now she wants to talk," James sneered, finally ready to beg for your life. "There's something coming," Seline continued, her voice tight with fear she was barely controlling. "Something much worse than those mean vampires I killed tonight. You're all in danger. The entire region is in danger." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Let me guess. You'll tell us all about it if we spare your life. How convenient." "This isn't about my life," Seline snapped, then forced herself to calm down. She had to make them understand without revealing too much. "There's an ancient vampire lord named Malachar. He's older than any creature you've ever met, and he commands legions of the dead. He's been gathering power in the Shadowlands for decades, and now he's making his move." The hunters exchanged glances, and Thomas let out a loud gasp. "An ancient vampire lord? What's next? Dragons and unicorns?" "I'm serious," Seline insisted. "He doesn't just control vampires, he commands ghouls, revenants, and things that have no name. His army moves like a plague across the land, destroying everything in its path. Humans and vampires alike fall before him." "And how exactly would a village woman know about this mysterious army?" Peter asked doubtfully. Seline gritted her teeth. She couldn't tell them she'd fought Malachar once before, 200 years ago, when he'd first tried to conquer the vampire courts. She'd barely managed to drive him back into the Shadow Realms then, and it had cost her dearly. She'd lost some of her most trusted friends in that battle, including several human hunters who'd fought beside her. I've heard stories," she said weakly, "from travelers and merchants. Strange disappearances, entire villages found empty with no sign of struggle. Witnesses speak of a figure in black armor leading hordes of the dead." "Stories," Marcus repeated mockingly. "Tavern tales and campfire nonsense. You'll have to do better than that if you want to save your neck." But David looked troubled. "Actually, there have been some strange reports lately. Remember that merchant caravan that never arrived in Millbrook? And the fishing village that went silent last month?" "Bandits and disease," James said as if it were obvious. "No need to bring up fairy tale monsters." Thrum, thrum, thrum. The sound was closer now, and with it came other noises. The distant crack of breaking trees, as if something huge was cutting a path through the forest. Seline could also hear howls that weren't quite wolf and weren't quite human, echoing from multiple directions. "Do you hear that?" she asked desperately. The hunters fell silent, trying hard to listen with their normal human hearing. After a moment, Marcus shrugged. "Wind in the trees? Maybe some wolves hunting." "That's not wolves," Seline said. "Those are hellhounds, Malachar's scouts. They're tracking the scent of living blood, marking targets for the main force." "Hellhounds?" Thomas repeated with exaggerated surprise. "This keeps getting better. What's next? Demons riding flaming horses?" "You have to evacuate the village," Seline pressed on, ignoring his sarcasm. "Get everyone to higher ground. Behind running water, if possible. Malachar's creatures have trouble crossing flowing streams." "Enough." Marcus slammed his fist on his knee. "I've heard enough of this nonsense. You're obviously desperate, making up elaborate stories to delay your execution. Well, it won't work." He stood up and kicked dirt over part of the campfire, making the flames dimmer. "We execute her at first light. End of discussion. No more delays, no more questions, no more fairy tales about vampire armies." "But what if she's telling the truth?" David asked quietly. "She's not," James said firmly. "Look at her. She's terrified and trying anything to save herself. I've seen it before with prisoners who are about to be executed. They'll say anything to buy more time." As if summoned by their disbelief, a long, sad howl echoed through the forest, closer than before, and definitely not from any natural wolf. It was answered by another howl from the opposite direction, then another from the north. The sounds formed a triangle around their position, slowly getting tighter. Seline's supervision caught movement in the trees, pale figures darting between the shadows, too quick and smooth to be human. The scouts had found them. "They're here," she whispered. "What's here?" Marcus demanded, but his hand automatically moved to the silver dagger at his belt. "The hunt has begun," she said grimly. "Malachar doesn't just kill his enemies, he plays with them first. Those howls, they're not random, they're coordination signals. His army is surrounding us." Another howl, much closer this time, was followed by the clear sound of something large crashing through the bushes. The hunters looked around nervously, their earlier confidence beginning to crack. "It's probably just wolves drawn to the fire," Peter said, but his voice didn't sound sure. "Wolves don't hunt in coordination patterns," Seline replied, "and they don't move that fast. You need to cut me loose and arm me. You're going to need every fighter you can get." "Like heck I will," Marcus said, but his eyes kept darting toward the forest. "You stay right where you are." The howling stopped suddenly, plunging the open space into an unnatural silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. Even the normal sounds of the night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, small animals moving through the bushes, had completely stopped. "Something's wrong?" David murmured, reaching for his crossbow. Seline closed her eyes and stretched out her supernatural senses, feeling the darkness beyond the firelight. What she found made her heart sink. They were completely surrounded. And this was just the beginning.
The morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and red as the hunters rode through the wooden gates of Millbrook Village, their horses' hooves clattering against the cobblestone main street. Marcus held the lead rope attached to Seline's bonds, showing her off like a prize as curious villagers emerged from their homes and shops to see what the fuss was about. "Make way!" Marcus called out proudly. "The hunters returned victorious!" Thomas raised his fist in the air, grinning broadly. "We caught ourselves a dangerous vampire sympathizer. Found her hanging out with bloodsuckers in the old Morrison barn." The villagers gasped and whispered among themselves, pressing closer to get a better look at the supposed criminal. Seline kept her head down, reddish-brown hair falling across her face as shame and frustration burned in her chest. These people, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, mothers with children, had no idea what was really coming for them. "Is it true, Marcus?" Eleanor Thorne, the village baker, asked, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "She was really working with vampires?" "Caught her red-handed," James declared, getting off his horse near the village fountain. 3 dead mean vampires, and this fool standing over them with a pitchfork, acting like some kind of hero. "She interfered with official hunter operations," Peter added, playing to the growing crowd. "Could have gotten those children killed with her careless meddling." An elderly man named Samuel Cross, who ran the village's small general store, shook his gray head in disgust. "What's wrong with people these days? Don't they know to leave monster hunting to the professionals?" "Probably thought she'd make a name for herself," suggested Maria Santos, a young mother, clutching her toddler's hand. "Some people will do anything for attention." Seline winced at each accusation. She'd saved those children's lives and eliminated 3 dangerous mean vampires that could have terrorized the region for months. But to these people, her bravery was carelessness, her sacrifice was attention-seeking, and her success was merely luck. "String her up!" shouted someone from the back of the crowd. "Make an example of her!" yelled another voice. Marcus raised his hand for silence, clearly enjoying his moment of power. "The council has decided that a regular person getting in the way of hunter operations is punishable by public execution. At sunset tonight, justice will be served."
The crowd cheered and clapped loudly. Children jumped up and down happily, not understanding how serious what they were celebrating was. Vendors began setting up stalls, expecting the crowds that would gather for the evening's entertainment.
As the hunters dragged Seline toward the village square, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. Above the trees to the east, storm clouds were gathering with unnatural speed, swirling in patterns that defied normal weather. More worrying still, she could smell the faint scent of rot on the wind. Not the normal breaking down of fallen leaves, but something older and more sinister. "Wait," she said urgently, turning to address Marcus. "Look at the sky. Those clouds aren't natural. You need to evacuate the village now while there's still time." Marcus glanced up as if it didn't matter. "Looks like rain to me. What's your point?" "It's not rain," Seline insisted. "It's a harbinger. Malakar's forces travel under cover of supernatural storms. The darkness helps hide their numbers and dampens human senses." "More vampire fairy tales," James sneered. "Give it a rest, woman. Your execution's in a few hours. You might as well accept it with dignity." But David looked troubled as he studied the approaching storm front. "That is a pretty strange cloud formation. Never seen anything quite like it." "Weather's been odd all season," Thomas said with a shrug. "Too much rain in spring, too hot in summer. Probably just another freak storm." As they continued through the village, Seline noticed other bad signs that the humans missed entirely. Birds were fleeing the area in massive flocks, their cries high and panicked. Dogs whined and whimpered, refusing to come when their owners called. Horses in the stable yard stamped nervously and rolled their eyes, nostrils flaring at scents only they could detect. Most disturbing of all was the silence creeping in from the surrounding forest. The normal daytime sounds, bird song, rustling leaves, insects buzzing, were gradually fading away, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. They reached the village square, where a wooden cage used for holding criminals stood near the old stone well. The structure was barely large enough for a person to sit upright, designed more for humiliation than comfort. Marcus took out a heavy iron key and unlocked the rusted door. "Your luxury accommodations await," he said mockingly, shoving Seline inside. The cage door clanged shut with a sound of finality. Through the wooden bars, Seline could see the villagers going about their daily business, completely unaware of the doom approaching their home. Children played games in the street, merchants called out their wares, and women hung laundry on lines strung between houses. All of them would be dead by morning if she couldn't find a way to warn them. "Please," she said, gripping the cage bars, "I'm begging you to listen. Evacuate the village. Get everyone to high ground behind running water if possible. Gather silver weapons, bless items, anything that might slow down supernatural creatures." "The only thing supernatural here is your ability to keep talking nonsense," Marcus replied, sitting into a chair someone had brought for him. "Guards, make sure our prisoner doesn't get any ideas about escaping." Two young village militiamen took positions near the cage, looking proud to be trusted with such an important duty. One of them, barely 18 years old, kept glancing at Seline with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Is it true you fought vampires?" he whispered when the hunters moved away. "Yes," Seline replied quietly, "and something much worse is coming. By tonight, this village will be under attack by creatures you can't imagine. You need to get your family to safety." The young guard looked nervously, then shook his head. "The hunters know best. They've protected us for generations." As the afternoon wore on, Seline watched the sky with growing dread. The storm clouds continued to gather and swirl, blocking out more and more of the sun. The temperature began to drop despite the season, and shadows grew longer and darker than they should have at that time of day. Around 4 o'clock, she noticed the first truly terrifying sign. The moon was becoming visible through the storm clouds, and it was the wrong color. Instead of its usual silver-white glow, the moon appeared blood red, as if it were being viewed through a crimson filter. "A blood moon during the day?" she thought grimly. "Malakar's power has grown stronger than I feared." The red moonlight seemed to energize the approaching storm.
Lightning began to flash within the clouds, not the normal white-blue electricity of natural weather, but sickly green bolts that left after images burned into the retina. "Look at the moon," she called out desperately. "Look at the color! That's not natural weather. It's a summoning storm." A few villagers glanced up, murmured nervously at the strange sight, then went back to their activities. The hunters didn't even bother to look. "Unusual atmospheric conditions," Marcus said dismissively. "Probably dust particles in the air from the drought last month." As sunset approached and the crowd began gathering for her execution, Seline closed her eyes and reached out with her supernatural senses. What she felt made her heart sink with despair. The army was less than an hour away. Thousands upon thousands of undead creatures were marching through the forest toward Millbrook, led by a presence so dark and evil that it made her soul pull back. Malachar had indeed grown stronger during his centuries away, and his forces were far larger than anything she had faced before, and she was trapped in a wooden cage about to be executed by the very people she was trying to save. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. The first scream pierced the night air just as the executioner's torch was being lit. It came from the eastern edge of the village where young Tommy Fletcher had been securing his family's chickens for the night. The sound was high and desperate, cut short so abruptly that everyone in the square froze, torch flames dancing in the sudden silence. "What was that?" Eleanor Thorne whispered, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Marcus frowned, hand automatically moving to his silver dagger. Probably just a fox in the henhouse. Nothing too. Another scream erupted from the same direction, followed immediately by two more from the north side of the village. These weren't the brief cries of someone startled by a wild animal. They were the long, agonized wails of people dying in terror. From her cage, Seline could see what the humans couldn't. Dark shapes were pouring out of the forest like a black tide, moving with unhuman speed and coordination. Her supervision picked out dozens of pale figures climbing the village walls with spider-like agility, while others flowed through the streets like living shadows. "They're here," she said quietly, gripping the wooden bars. "What's here?" David asked nervously, drawing his crossbow. Before Seline could answer, the Fletcher Helm farm exploded into flames. Not the gradual spread of an accidental fire, but an instantaneous, huge fire that swallowed the entire building in seconds. Through the orange glow, villagers could see shapes moving within the inferno, shapes that seemed unaffected by the deadly heat. "Dear God," Marcus breathed, finally understanding that this wasn't some minor problem. That's when hell truly erupted. Creatures poured into the village square from every direction. Vampires, yes, but not like the mean ones Seline had faced in the barn. These were organized, disciplined soldiers of the undead, their pale skin marked with ritual scars and their eyes glowing with evil intelligence. They wore ancient armor that shined with dark magic, and they moved with the precision of a military unit. Behind them came worse things. Ghouls with long limbs and razor-sharp claws bounded across rooftops with sickening smoothness. Revenants, dead bodies animated by dark magic, stumbled forward with rotting flesh hanging from their bones. And moving between them all were the hellhounds Seline had warned about. Creatures the size of horses, with burning red eyes and fangs that dripped acid spit. The villagers scattered in every direction, screaming in panic as their peaceful world transformed into a nightmare. Maria Santos tried to run with her toddler held to her chest, but a vampire stopped her with unhuman speed. The vampire's fangs sank into her throat, and her scream became a wet gurgle as blood poured down her dress. "No!" David shouted, raising his crossbow and firing a silver bolt. It struck the vampire on the shoulder, spinning the creature around but not dropping it. The vampire hissed and turned towards David with burning hatred in its eyes. "Form up!" Marcus bellowed, drawing his silver blade. "Protective circle around the square. Don't let them separate us." But it was already too late. The attack had been perfectly coordinated, hitting multiple points simultaneously to prevent any organized defense. James found himself facing 3 ghouls at once, his blessed sword flashing as he tried to keep their claws from his throat. Thomas was backing towards the well, silver dagger in one hand and a burning torch in the other, as a pair of revenants closed in from opposite sides. Peter never had a chance. A hellhound leaped from the roof of the baker's shop and landed on top of him, its massive weight crushing him to the ground. His final scream was cut short by jaws that clamped down on his skull. From her cage, Seline watched the slaughter with growing horror. Samuel Cross, the elderly store owner, was cornered by a vampire who seemed to be playing with him, making shallow cuts with its claws while the old man begged for mercy. 3 children had taken refuge behind an overturned cart, but ghouls were circling them like vultures, making their terror last longer before the kill. "Please," she called out to Marcus, who was fighting desperately against 2 vampires. "Release me. I can help you." "Stay back, witch," Marcus snarled, not understanding that she was trying to save him rather than join the attack. A vampire's claws raked across his arm, tearing through leather armor and drawing blood. The worst part was that this wasn't even the main assault. Seline could sense a much larger force holding back in the forest, waiting for some signal. This was just the opening move, designed to spread chaos and terror while testing the village's defenses, and those defenses were rapidly falling apart. David managed to put a silver bolt through a ghoul's heart, dropping it to the ground in a pile of rotting flesh, but 2 more immediately took its place. Thomas was backed against the well now, bleeding from multiple wounds as the revenants pressed their attack. James had managed to cut off 1 ghoul's head, but the other 2 had gotten past his guard and were cutting him with their claws. Flames were spreading throughout the village as more buildings caught fire. The screams of burning villagers mixed with the howls of hellhounds and the hissing of vampires in a symphony of pure horror. Bodies littered the square, some drained of blood, others torn apart by claws, still others burned beyond recognition. "Mama!" a small voice cried out. Celine's heart clenched as she saw little Sarah Wilson, no more than 6 years old, standing alone in the middle of the chaos. The girl's mother lay motionless nearby, her neck twisted at an impossible angle, while 3 vampires slowly approached the terrified child with predatory smiles. "Such sweet young blood," one of them hissed, fangs gleaming in the firelight. "It's been so long since we've tasted innocence." "Please don't hurt me," Sarah whimpered, tears streaming down her face. The vampire reached out with a pale hand, its fingers almost touching the child's cheek. "Don't worry, little one. It will only hurt for a moment." That's when Seline felt something inside her snap. 400 years of hiding, 400 years of pretending to be weak while watching the innocent suffer, 400 years of letting the descendants of her allies treat her like a criminal while real monsters slaughtered their people. No more. Her eyes began to glow with an inner fire that had nothing to do with reflected flame. Power rushed through her body like molten gold, and the wooden bars of her cage started to smoke where her hands gripped them. The choice between keeping her secret and doing what was right had finally been made. "Get away from her," Seline said, her voice carrying a note of command that made every creature in the square freeze. The vampire touching Sarah's face slowly turned toward the cage, confusion replacing hunger in its glowing eyes. It was about to learn why humans had once called her the Crimson Regent, and why even the darkest creatures of the night had once knelt before her throne. "Seline! Seline, help us!" The desperate cry cut through the chaos of battle like a knife through silk. 3 small figures came running across the blood-soaked square, dodging between fallen bodies and leaping over pools of fire. The same children Seline had saved in the barn just hours earlier. The blonde girl, Annie, reached the cage first, her dress torn and soot-stained, tears streaming down her face. Behind her came Tommy, the boy who'd thanked her so honestly, and little Marcus, named after the hunter, though the irony was lost to everyone in that moment. They pressed themselves against the wooden bars of her prison, seeking protection from the nightmare that had consumed their village. "They killed Mama and Papa," Annie sobbed, gripping the cage bars with tiny hands. "We ran like you told us to," Tommy said through chattering teeth. "When the bad things came, we ran to find you." The vampire that had been threatening little Sarah Wilson turned away from its intended victim, drawn by the scent of fresh terror.
Its pale lips curved into a cruel smile as it spotted the 3 children huddled against Celine's cage. More little lambs. How thoughtful of you to gather in one place. It will make this so much easier. 2 more vampires moved to the sides of their companion, forming a triangle around the cage. Behind them, ghouls circled like vultures, their long claws clicking against the cobblestones. The children pressed closer to the wooden bars, their small bodies trembling with terror. "Please don't let them hurt us," Annie whispered, looking up at Seline with complete trust in her green eyes. "You saved us before. Save us again." Celine's heart clenched as she saw the 3 innocent faces pressed against her cage, children who believed in her completely, who had run to her for protection while their world burned around them. Then she looked at the approaching monsters, their fangs gleaming with excitement, their eyes glowing with evil hunger. 4 centuries of secrets, 4 centuries of careful lies and purposeful weakness, 4 centuries of watching from the shadows while the world forgot who she really was. No more. Her eyes began to glow with an inner fire that had nothing to do with reflected flame. Power rushed through her body like molten gold, and the wooden bars of her cage started to smoke where her hands gripped them. Then they cracked. Then they splintered, then they exploded outward in a shower of broken wood and twisted metal. Seline rose to her full height, and as she did, her human disguise fell away like clothes she didn't need anymore. Her reddish-brown hair darkened to midnight black and seemed to move in a wind that touched nothing else. Her fangs extended, not the rough, yellowed things of common vampires, but perfect, ivory daggers that gleamed with their own inner light. A supernatural aura came out of her body like heat from a furnace, an aura of such raw power that even the attacking creatures stumbled backward in shock. But it was her presence that truly revealed what she was. For 400 years, she had been careful to hide the natural dominance that marked her as royalty among the undead. Now she let it blaze forth completely, and every vampire, ghoul, and revenant in the square felt it like a physical blow. "Impossible," breathed the vampire who had been threatening the children. "The Crimson Regent! She's just a legend!" "No," Seline said, stepping from the ruins of her cage with smooth grace. "I'm much worse than a legend. I'm real." The attacking creatures fell back, their organized assault dissolving into confusion and fear. Lesser vampires dropped to their knees automatically, their minds overwhelmed by the presence of their ultimate ruler. Ghouls whined and whimpered like beaten dogs. Even the hellhounds tucked their tails and slunk away from the blazing figure that had emerged from what they thought was just another human prison. Marcus Blackwood stood frozen in the middle of the square, his silver blade hanging forgotten in his grip. His mouth opened and closed silently as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This was the woman he'd mocked as a careless town person. This was the prisoner he sentenced to death for interfering with professional monster hunters. This was the vampire queen his ancestors had fought alongside, whose very existence his group had spent centuries denying. "Impossible," he whispered, echoing the vampire's words. "You're supposed to be dead. The old bloodline ended centuries ago." "Did it?" Seline asked, her voice carrying layers of meaning that cut through his soul. "Tell me, Marcus Blackwood, descendant of William the Bold, do you remember the oath your family swore to mine?" The silver blade slipped from Marcus's shaking fingers, clattering on the cobblestones around him. His fellow hunters stared in shocked silence as the impossible became reality. David's crossbow hung loose in his grip. James leaned heavily against a cart, blood draining from his face.
Thomas simply stood there, mouth open, his entire understanding of the world falling apart around him. "The Alliance," Marcus breathed, pieces of half-remembered stories surfacing from the depths of his family's spoken history. "The old pacts? The blood bonds sworn in moonlight and sealed with silver?" Seline confirmed, stepping toward him with careful grace. "Your great-great-great-grandfather knelt before my throne and pledged his line to the protection of the innocent, human and vampire alike. He called me sister in arms and friend to his people." She pointed toward the bloody mess around them. "And now his descendant mocks me as a fool?
while the very evil we once fought together devours the village he swore to protect? A new sound echoed from the forest, a sound that made even Seline's ancient heart skip a beat. It was the deep, resounding toll of a war horn carved from bone and enchanted with dark magic. The main assault was beginning. "What's that sound?" David asked, his voice cracking with fear. "That," Seline said grimly, "is Malachar announcing his presence. What you've seen so far was just the advance guard, a few dozen vampires and their pets sent to test your defenses and spread terror." The horn sounded again, longer this time, and the ground began to shake with the rhythm of thousands of marching feet. "The real army is coming now," Seline continued, her crimson eyes scanning the trees where shapes were beginning to emerge. "Malachar himself leads them, a vampire lord so ancient and powerful that he makes me look like a child. He commands not dozens, but thousands of undead creatures, all bound to his will by blood, magic, and terror." She looked down at the three children still huddled at her feet, then back at Marcus and his surviving hunters. "So tell me, Marcus Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 4 centuries of betrayal and loss, "will you honor your ancestors' oath and fight beside me as your family once did? Or will you cling to your lies and watch everyone you've sworn to protect die screaming in the darkness?" The war horn sounded a third time, and from the forest came the answering howls of 10,000 creatures hungry for blood and destruction. The choice was his to make, but time was running out for all of them. For a long moment, Marcus stared at Seline in stunned silence, his mind reeling from centuries of lies being stripped away in an instant. The war horn echoed again, from the forest, closer now, and the ground trembled beneath the advance of Malachar's vast army. Then, something shifted in the hunter's eyes. A spark of recognition, of ancestral memory, suddenly awakened. "The silver pendant," he whispered, reaching into his shirt to pull out a tarnished locket that had been passed down through generations of Blackwoods. "My great-great-great-grandfather's dying words," he said to remember the Crimson Ally. "When darkness comes again." Celine's eyes widened as she saw the pendant, a silver disc engraved with both the Blackwood family crest and her own royal seal, intertwined as symbols of eternal alliance. "William kept his word," she said softly. "Even when the world forgot, he preserved the truth." Marcus looked at his surviving men, David, James, and Thomas, all watching him with desperate uncertainty. Then he looked at the children huddled against Celine's legs, their faces streaked with tears and soot. Finally, he looked at the burning village around them, at the bodies of people he'd sworn to protect. "My family's honor," he said quietly, then louder. "My family's honor stands with yours, Your Majesty." He dropped to one knee, followed immediately by David, and then, after a moment's hesitation, by James and Thomas. "The Blackwood line remembers its oath. We stand with you against the darkness." "Then rise, my friends," Seline said, her voice carrying both authority and warmth. "Rise and fight as your ancestors once did, not as hunters and vampire, but as allies against true evil." The forest exploded. Thousands of undead creatures poured from the trees like a black tide. Vampires in ancient armor, ghouls with eyes like burning coals, skeletal warriors wielding rusted weapons, and hellhounds the size of war horses. Above them flew nightmare creatures with leathery wings and talons like swords, their shrieks piercing the night air. And at their head rode Malachar himself, the ancient vampire lord side astride a massive hellhound, his armor forged from blackest steel and inscribed with runes that hurt to look at directly. His face was a mask of noble cruelty, pale as moonlight, with eyes like burning emeralds. Most terrible of all was the crown upon his head, a circle of bone and dark metal that pulsed with evil energy. "Seline," his voice boomed across the square, carrying supernatural power that made windows shatter and weak-willed creatures cower. "The pretender queen reveals herself at last. How fitting that I should reclaim my rightful throne by destroying you in front of your pathetic human pets. You were never fit to rule, Malachar," Seline called back, her own voice resonating with 4 centuries of authority. "That's why the vampire courts cast you out, and I will cast you into the abyss where you belong." She moved like lightning, crossing the 100 yards between them in the blink of an eye. Her first strike, a devastating punch enhanced by supernatural strength, sent Malachar flying from his mount to crash through the wall of the blacksmith shop.
The battle that followed was beyond anything the hunters had ever witnessed. Seline fought with skills learned over 4 centuries of combat, her movements flowing like a deadly dance as she used powers the modern world had forgotten. She summoned crimson fire that burned only her enemies, weaving spells of binding and banishment that turned Malakar's own servants against him. When 3 hellhounds leapt at her simultaneously, she moved her hand and they froze in midair, being held by telekinetic force before being thrown into the attacking vampire ranks. Malakar proved equally strong. His own magic was older and darker than hers, drawn from forbidden sources that whispered of corruption and decay. Shadow tendrils erupted from the ground to wrap around Seline's limbs, while necrotic energy crackled from his fingertips. When she broke free and lunged at him with fangs bared, he caught her wrist, and they wrestled with strength that cracked the cobblestones beneath their feet. "You cannot win, little queen," he snarled, his grip leaving bruises on her immortal flesh. "I've grown stronger in exile, while you played at being human." "Strength isn't everything," Seline replied, driving her knee into his stomach with bone-shattering force. "Sometimes wisdom matters." Around them, the hunters fought with renewed purpose. Marcus used his silver blade with deadly precision, cutting down ghouls while shouting commands to coordinate their defense. David's crossbow shot repeatedly, each blessed bolt finding its mark in vampire hearts. James and Thomas fought back to back, creating a barrier of blessed steel that no undead creature could break through. "For the Alliance," Marcus roared, cutting off a vampire that had been about to strike down a wounded villager. "For the old Pax," the Blackwood line remembers, David added, putting a bolt through a ghoul's skull. "We stand with our queen." Seeing the hunters fight beside her with such courage awakened something in Seline's heart, a warmth she hadn't felt in centuries. These were William's descendants, carrying on the legacy of honor and sacrifice that had made the original alliance so powerful. But Malakar was not finished. With a roar of fury, he unleashed his most terrible spell, a wave of pure necrotic energy that withered everything it touched. Plants died instantly, stone cracked and crumbled, and even the air itself seemed to rot. Seline had only one choice. She spread her arms wide and drew upon the deepest reserves of her power, calling upon magic she hadn't used in 2 centuries. Light erupted from her body, not the crimson fire of vampire magic, but pure silver radiance that burned away Malakar's darkness like dawn chasing away night. The 2 forces met in the center of the square with a sound like thunder. Energy crackled between them, reality itself seeming to bend and twist under the strain. Buildings shook, the very air ignited, and creatures on both sides were thrown to the ground by the shockwave. When the light faded, Malakar lay sprawled on the cobblestones, his ancient armor cracked and smoking. The bone crown had shattered, its dark gems scattered like worthless pebbles. His remaining forces, those that hadn't been destroyed by the magical blast, fled shrieking into the forest. The victory came at a terrible price. Seline swayed on her feet, silver blood flowing from dozens of wounds. The massive use of power had drained her almost completely, and her immortal flesh was beginning to show the accumulated damage of 4 centuries of existence. "Your Majesty," Marcus caught her as she stumbled, holding her gently against his chest. "It's finished," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Malakar is defeated, his army scattered." Around them, the surviving villagers and hunters gathered in quiet silence, finally understanding the huge event they had witnessed. The 3 children, Annie, Tommy, and little Marcus, pressed close to her side, tears streaming down their faces. "You saved us," Annie whispered. "You saved everyone." Seline smiled weakly, her crimson eyes already beginning to fade. "That's what queens are for." The first rays of dawn began to creep over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose.
But for Seline, the light was growing dim. Her 400-year reign was finally coming to an end. As the first golden rays of dawn crossed the eastern mountains, Seline felt her ancient strength finally beginning to ebb away, like the tide retreating from the shore. The massive use of power required to defeat Malakar had pushed her immortal body beyond its limits, and 4 centuries of carefully hidden wounds were finally demanding their due. She collapsed to her knees in the village square, silver blood spreading across the cobblestones like spilled moonlight. Around her, the survivors gathered in quiet respect,
hunters and villagers alike, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe, gratitude, and deep shame. Marcus was the first to kneel beside her, his rough hands gentle as he helped support her failing form. "Your Majesty, please tell us how to help you. There must be something we can do." Seline smiled weakly, her crimson eyes already beginning to fade to their original green. "There's nothing left to do, my friend. I've held on for 400 years, waiting for this moment, waiting to see the alliance restored one final time." "We didn't know," David whispered, dropping to his knees beside Marcus. "We had no idea who you really were. The stories, they made us forget." "Made us forget our own honor," James added, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt as well. "We mocked you. We sentenced you to death, and all the while, you were trying to save us." Thomas was the last to kneel, tears streaming down his rough face. "Can you ever forgive us, Your Majesty? Can you forgive us for betraying everything our ancestors stood for?" "There's nothing to forgive," Seline said softly, reaching out to touch each of their faces in turn. "You were taught lies, but when the moment came, you chose truth. You honored the old bonds when it mattered most. William would be proud of you all." The three children, Annie, Tommy, and little Marcus, pressed close to her, their small hands reaching out to touch her arms and shoulders, as if their innocent touch could somehow keep her in the world. "Don't go," Annie whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't leave us." "I have to, little one," Seline replied, stroking the child's blonde hair with trembling fingers. "But I'm not really leaving. I'll live on in the stories you tell, and in the truth you choose to remember." Marcus pulled out the silver pendant again, the one bearing both family crests intertwined. "We'll restore the truth, Your Majesty. We'll tell the world what really happened here, the real alliance, the real history." "Yes," Seline breathed, her voice growing fainter with each word. "But remember, not all vampires are evil, just as not all humans are good. Protect those who choose peace, whether they have fangs or not. The darkness you fight isn't in the blood, it's in the choices people make." Her eyes found Marcus's face, and in them he saw the weight of centuries, the loneliness of keeping terrible secrets, and the deep love for humanity that had sustained her through 400 years of being away. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise you'll rebuild the alliance. Promise you'll teach your children the real stories. Promise you'll stand guard against true evil, no matter what form it takes." "We promise," Marcus said solemnly, and the other hunters echoed his words like a sacred vow. As her breathing grew shallower, Seline turned her gaze toward the eastern sky, where the sun was painting the clouds in brilliant shades of gold and rose. "So beautiful," she murmured. "I'd forgotten how beautiful dawn could be when you're not afraid of it anymore." Her eyes closed for the final time as the sunlight touched her face, and Seline Crimson, the last vampire queen, the Crimson Regent, defender of the innocent and guardian of the ancient alliance, passed peacefully into legend. For several long minutes, no one moved. Then Marcus gently lifted her body in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, as if some essential part of her had already departed. "Where do we take her?" David asked quietly. Marcus looked toward the ancient forest beyond the village, where old stone foundations marked the ruins of buildings that were older than human memory. Vines had covered much of the structure, but the altar at its center remained intact, engraved with words in the old language that spoke of peace between the children of day and night. They laid Seline's body upon the altar, her hands folded peacefully across her chest. In death, She looked not like the terrible warrior who had battled Malachar, but like the young woman who had first taken the crown 4 centuries ago, determined to build a better world. Here lies Seline the Just, last of the vampire queens, first of the Alliance. She who was mocked became our salvation. She who was condemned became our Redeemer. The other hunters knelt around the altar, and the children placed wildflowers they had gathered along the way. As the sun climbed higher, painting the temple in warm golden light, they spoke the old words that bound their bloodlines to hers, renewing oaths that should never have been forgotten. "We will remember," they said in unison. "We will guard the peace. We will honor the Alliance." And they would. In the years that followed, Marcus Blackwood and his fellow hunters would work constantly to restore the true history, teaching new generations about the vampire queen who had died to save them all. They would seek out peaceful vampires living in hiding and offer them protection. They would stand as bridges between 2 worlds that had been kept apart by fear and lies. The Alliance would rise again, stronger than before, built on a foundation of truth rather than legend. And in the temple where she rested, Seline's legacy would continue, a reminder that true nobility lies not in bloodline or species, but in the courage to stand for what is right, even when the whole world has forgotten who you really are. The queen they had mocked had saved them all, and they would never forget her again.